This is LSAT PrepTest 151, Section 1, Passage 3. This is a comparative passage about opera. The question is whether music and words belong together or apart. This is a low difficulty passage. The disagreement's pretty straightforward, but there is a sneaky area of agreement that could trip you up on the questions. Now, the most important moment in this passage pair is the second half of passage B. This is where the author commits to a position that directly contradicts passage A. And so if you read passage B as being just a history of opera types, you're going to miss the argument entirely. Now, passage A gets to the point pretty fast. Music doesn't need words. In fact, words drag it down. The author's logic goes like this. Words can trigger emotions, but they can't fully express them. Music can. And so when you attach words to music, you're weakening the stronger art form. You get a flashy result, but you lose purity. The phrase greater alone is doing all the work here. That is the thesis in 2 words. Now, you don't want to read too fast through the middle of passage A. There is a concession hiding in there. The author admits various good ends can come from combining music and words, but only if the words stay subordinate to the music. And that is a real qualifying statement. It means the author isn't saying the combination's always terrible. They're saying music should always be in charge, and ideally, it wouldn't need the help at all. If you compress this into just saying, passage A says music and words should never mix, you have overshot, and the questions will punish you for it. Now, the example of Beethoven's Fifth and the opera comments at the end are just reinforcement. The author is piling on, not adding any new ideas. You want to move through this part quickly. You already have the author's position. Now, passage B starts with what looks like a classification system. There are 3 types of opera: music dominant, balanced, and music subordinate. You don't want to get bogged down memorizing these categories. They're just set up. The author mentions the 3rd type, where music takes a back seat, did not survive. It couldn't hold an audience. And that detail matters more than it might seem. If the author is quietly agreeing that music has to be central, that's pretty important. You want to file that away. Now, the real argument here kicks in around the middle of passage B. This is where you've got to slow down. The author makes a claim that sounds simple, but actually is pretty deep. They're saying you cannot judge the music or the poetry of an opera by itself. The music isn't good because it would work well in a concert hall, and the poetry isn't good because it reads well on a page. Each piece is only good if it serves the opera as a whole. And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about art than what passage A is proposing. Passage A wants to pull the elements apart and rank them. Passage B says pulling them apart destroys the thing you're trying to evaluate. And then you get the analogy at the very end. Music and poetry in opera are like hydrogen and oxygen in water. That's important. That's the author's strongest version of their argument. Of course, you could analyze the parts separately if you want, but in practice, they are combined, they're fused together. You can't have water without both. And so here is the disagreement, and you've got to get this precise. It's not about whether music matters. Both authors agree music is the most important element. Passage A says it outright. Passage B calls it the most important too. And that overlap is bait. You're going to see choices that frame their disagreement as being about the importance of music, and those are wrong. The actual disagreement here is about separation. Passage A says music is strongest on its own, it can stand alone, and it should. Words are a compromise at best. Passage B says the whole point of opera is fusion, and judging any element in isolation misses what opera actually is. Now, here is another trap you want to watch for. Passage A does talk about opera. The author even concedes that opera's value comes from its emotional range. So you might see an answer that says both authors value opera's emotional power. And that could be tempting, but Passage A's author is really saying the emotional power comes from the music, despite the words, not because of the combination. So that agreement is only surface level. Underneath, they're pointing in opposite directions. Now, before you go on to the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, what is the one condition under which Passage A's author accepts combining music and words? Second, why does Passage B bring up that failed 3rd type of opera? It's not random, it's doing structural work. And third, if the author of Passage A read that hydrogen and oxygen analogy, what would they say is wrong with it?